And thanks to the sponsors and conveners of this. And unfortunately, I didn't get to see some of the other presenters because I'm a Christian pastor. And so here in the Midwest of the United States, it's Sunday morning. And I had many duties that, as Tolkien might say, I did not neglect. But it's great to be with you now. And I look forward to seeing many of the others as they are placed on YouTube. So what I want to ask today is, when we think about the Lord of the Rings especially, but Tolkien's works more broadly, and we think about one particular book in the Christian tradition, the canonical book of Revelation, is there anything that Tolkien's writing, especially in the Lord of the Rings, can do to help us understand another way to look at the book of Revelation? I've been working on this for many years. In fact, I gave a beginning presentation of this thesis at Oxenmoot back in 2018, and I want to share with you just a little more of what I've come up with. First, I'd like to start by saying we're going to be discussing the Christian biblical book of Revelation, and I know that the Christianity is not the tradition for many folks who might be participating now. I also want to remind everyone that I understand there are lots of very important interpretive traditions around the book of Revelation. And so as I'm offering what I offer today, it may challenge or contradict some of those interpretive schemas. I offer my remarks to continue a conversation about what it means to think about the idea of apocalypse, from the Greek apokalypsis, which generally means unveiling or revealing. And so we'll begin to think about that. So first, about Revelation itself. I'm a mainline seminary professor and university professor and a pastor, and most of the people that I talk with and work with in Christianity haven't even read the book of Revelation. It's at the end of most Christian Bibles, and folks kind of stay away from it. Even several students in a Revelation course that I taught hadn't read the book before they took the course at seminary. So what is it about this book of the Christian Bible? I mean, after all, the Lord of the Rings has some elements that we also find in Revelation. Seemingly otherworld creatures, dragons, for example, evil incarnate. In the letter to Milton Waldman, I mentioned in a little bit, Tolkien refers to Sauron as the last incarnation of evil. That's Revelation sounding stuff. And something akin to the end of all things. Remember Frodo and Sam standing together after the destruction of the ring. Everybody here at least, likes to read the Lord of the Rings. So why not Revelation? Here's some thoughts on Revelation from a few authors. D.H. Lawrence wrote derisively, "What we realize when we have read the precious book a few times is that John the Divine had, on the face of it, a grandiose scheme for wiping out and annihilating everybody who wasn't of the elect, the chosen people, in short, and of climbing up himself right onto the throne of God." New Testament scholar Walter Wink writes, "Revelation, however, despite its penetrating insights about the domination system, is filled with a craving, not for redemptive violence, but something even worse, punitive violence, to be carried out by God, of course, so that John himself keeps his own hands clean. We're a long, long way from Jesus here." And finally, New Testament scholar John Dominic Crossan, "Revelation's promise of a bloodthirsty God and a blood-drenched Christ represents for me the creation of a second coming to negate the first and only coming of Christ. The fabrication of violent apocalypse to deny non-violent incarnation, and the invention of Christ on a war horse to erase the historical Jesus on a peace donkey. Jesus' non-violent resistance to evil is replaced by Christ's violent slaughter of evildoers." So Revelation has a rough reputation even amongst Christian believers and writers. So given all of that, what would it mean to read Revelation perhaps from a different perspective? I'd like for us to think about that somewhat today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I want to ask, where in the story are we? As interpreters and readers of the book of Revelation, and as interpreters and readers of Tolkien's, especially The Lord of the Rings. And I'm going to look particularly at the epilogue. First of all, apocalypse. So when scholars talk about what revelation is, they, following this Greek word apocalypsis, call it apocalypse, which is a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality, which is both temporal, insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, something that will happen, and spatial, insofar as it involves another supernatural world. And it's intended to interpret present earthly circumstances in light of the supernatural world and of the future, and by influence, and to influence rather, both the understanding and the behavior of the audience by means of divine authority. Well, I want to back out from that and suggest that in many ways, The Lord of the Rings is apocalyptic. It's revelatory literature. It shows us things we wouldn't otherwise see. In fact, Tolkien himself talked about it being revealed to him as part of his writing process, as well as all of the legendarium. And it invites us to look at a world that doesn't quite seem to be our world. Right? And Tolkien has written that sometimes that it is our world, only in a different time and different shape, etc. But in some ways, we're invited through this narrative framework to read revelatory literature. And certainly, otherworldly beings help us to understand this as we think about the Maya and Eru, as were mentioned before, and as we think about each of the creatures. And I think this is important, when Revelation talks about a supernatural world, it's talking about super as beyond and above our world. But I want us to bring that down to the sense of the supernatural that Tolkien talks about in On Fairy Stories, which is that not super by above and out of this world, but super being really super duper this world. When Tolkien talks about fairy, he means this worldly things in their most critical sense. So that's how we look at apocalypses. And I want to argue that in many ways, we have an apocalyptic story of sorts in The Lord of the Rings. Certainly not the only apocalyptic story in all of Tolkien's writings. There are several of those stories that we could consider apocalyptic. Now, if The Lord of the Rings is an apocalypse, and if Revelation, as I'm going to suggest, is really a fairy story. Tolkien, of course, talks about the gospel being the ultimate true fairy story. And I want us to think about the book of Revelation that way. I'm wondering, what do these stories have to say to one another? I believe that many of the aforementioned concerns about violent and vengeful nature of God and many interpretations of Revelation might be helpfully addressed by employing the Lord of the Rings as an interpretive lens. So I'm proposing a specific perspectival lens, that of Sam Gamgee and the Red Book. The Lord of the Rings presents an apocalyptic end of the Third Age of Middle-earth, and then presents a curative post-apocalyptic scenario. As the kingship in Gondor is restored, new relationships begin, and the hobbits return for the scouring of the Shire. These steps allow us to see beyond the end of all things to a post-apocalyptic moment in which the earthly consequences and communal ethical implications of the apocalypse are explored and reiterated. Looking back at the end of the age offers a perspective that many fail to find as they encounter the book of Revelation. I think it's because they might be overlooking important elements of the story, especially of the story with the epilogue. More on the epilogue in a moment. First, a word about endings. Many Christian interpreters read Revelation as a story in which the final decisive moment occurs sometime in the future, with the violent and bloody overthrow of God's opponents, the beasts, the false witness, and the dragon. This leaves us standing, looking ahead, awaiting a violent and cosmic incursion and a cathartic killing spree, before we finally enter our beautiful, many-gated city and celebrate the renewal of all things. This is how the movie makers and goers tend to prefer it. Cut to the chase, get to the battle, shoot the action scene. Hero kills evil villain. Hero celebrates romantic relationship. The end. The Lord of the Rings flies in the face of all of that. Now, I used to live in Southern Africa for about 4 years in the early 2000s, which meant that all of the movies I saw in the theater were screened at a shopping mall in Bloemfontein, South Africa. Bloemfontein, the birthplace of J.R.R. Tolkien, is where I saw Peter Jackson's version of The Return of the King. Here's the thing. Once the ring had been destroyed, my friend Mark, who was with me at the movie, kept getting up to leave. He'd seen the decisive moment. The ring was destroyed. It was over. The villain had died. It was over. End of story. He was antsy during the whole rest of the falling action and denouement. Jackson ended the movie way too slowly for my friend Mark, who expected a future-oriented apocalypse. Jackson ended the movie way too soon for me, and I contend for J.R.R. Tolkien. In addition to the usual Western overemphasis on battle and violence, the Jackson film didn't spend enough time exploring the post-apocalyptic moment and its implications. Once it was revealed that the ring had been destroyed, once Sauron and all of his armies are disseminated, and once the people are returning to the city and we see the field of Cormallen and the coronation and the return to the Shire and the scouring, we are in this sort of post-apocalyptic moment where we can look back on the victory or the conquering that has occurred. So where are we in the story? Well, the position that we hold in the story changes if we read of the Lord of the Rings as it was initially intended by J.R.R. Tolkien, and that is with the epilogue. I want to talk first about how we find our place in the story, and Tolkien helps us to understand that in the Lord of the Rings. And here we've got Sam and Frodo talking to one another. They're at the stairs of Cirith Ungol, and we have, why, sir, I never thought of that before. You've got some of the light of it in that star glass that the lady gave you. Why, to think of it, we're in the same tale still. It's going on. Don't the great tales never end? No, they never end as tales, said Frodo, but the people in them come and go when their part's ended. Our part will end later or sooner. I wonder what sort of a tale we've fallen into. I wonder, said Frodo, but I don't know. And that's the way of a real tale. Take anyone that you're fond of. You may know or guess what kind of a tale it is, happy ending or sad ending, but the people in it don't know and don't want to know. You don't want them to. And then you and I, Sam, are still stuck in the worst places of the story. And it's all too likely that some will say at this point, shut the book now, Dad. We don't want to read anymore. Maybe, said Sam, but I wouldn't be one to say that. Things done and over and made into a part of the great tales are different. Where are we in the story? Berlin Flieger has written, Tolkien's mythos is a mirror, reflecting at a distance the themes and actions of many mythologies, but leaving at the center a space for his audience to see itself and thus to participate in the story. If we see ourselves in this story, where are we and how has the author helped us to find our place? Tolkien says in On Fairy Stories, the realm of fairy stories wide and deep and high, filled with many things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril, both joy and sorrow as sharp as swords. In that realm, a man may perhaps count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very richness and strangeness tie the tongue of a traveler who would report them. And while he's there, it's dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gates should be shut and the keys be lost. I wonder if John the seer felt the same way about his engagement of the vision that he's had that's reported in Revelation. This is from Christopher Tolkien in History of Middle-earth. The words that end The Lord of the Rings, "Well, I'm back," he said, were not intended to do so when my father wrote them in the long draft manuscript A, which has been followed in the previous chapters. It's obvious from the manuscripts that the text continued without break, and there is, in fact, no indication that my father thought of what he was writing as markedly separate from what preceded. It cannot be doubted that this was how he intended at that time that the Lord of the Rings should end. What we're talking about is what's now called the epilogue that we read in History of Middle-earth. The epilogue went through multiple drafts, and the final draft is what we see at the end of Christopher's presentation. And we know that the epilogue was a part of Tolkien's initial plans because we have from a letter to Christopher himself from 1944, Tolkien writing, a lot of this work will be done in a final chapter where Sam is found reading out of an enormous book to his children and answering all their questions about what happened to everybody. That will link up with his discourse on the nature of stories and the stairs of Cirith Ungol. But the final scene will be the passage of Bilbo and Elrond and Galadriel through the woods of the Shire on their way to the Grey Havens. Frodo will join them and pass over the sea, linking with the vision he had of a far green country in the house of Tom Bombadil. Tolkien also mentions this in his letter to Milton Waldman. It's toward the end of that letter, and so was not in the original edition of letters, but it's now in the revised and expanded edition. But you could find it in History of Middle-earth, and you could also find it at Marquette University at the Tolkien archives there as well. But Tolkien already and still by 1951 was talking about the importance of this epilogue. Then he rides home, his wife welcomes him to the firelight and his first child, and he says simply, "Well, I've come back." There's a brief epilogue in which we see Sam among his children, a glance at his love for Eleanor, the elvish name of a flower in Lorien, his eldest, who by a strange gift has the looks and beauty of an elven maid. In her, all his love and longing for elves is resolved and satisfied. And they're reading together out of the big red book. This, of course, is what becomes the Red Book of Westmarch when Eleanor marries, becomes a Fairbane and moves away to Westmarch. But what we have here is Sam passing on the story to his family. Tolkien also mentions this in 1954 in a letter to Naomi Mitchison, as he mentions that Hobbit children were delightful, but I'm afraid that the only glimpses of them in the book are found at the beginning of volume 1. An epilogue giving a further glimpse, though of a rather exceptional family, has been so universally condemned that I shall not insert it. One must stop somewhere. Lots of folks didn't want Tolkien to include the epilogue, but he thought it was important. So much, though, so that in 1955, still in a letter to Catherine Farrar, he writes, "I feel the picture incomplete without something on Samwise and Eleanor, but I cannot devise anything that would not have destroyed the ending or people's opinions of the ending more than the hints, possibly sufficient in the appendices." By the way, while Tolkien was writing The Lord of the Rings and thinking deeply about his story, he was friends with Catherine and Austin Farrar, while Austin was writing 2 complete volumes on the book of Revelation. I haven't found anything that confirms that they had conversations about those writing projects, but I often wonder. And again, in the appendix of The Lord of the Rings, he talks about the coming of the king that we read about in the epilogue. Tolkien went so far for the epilogue as to create fair copies of letters from the king announcing his coming to near the Shire. The king would not enter the Shire to see his beloved friends, Samwise Gamgee, his name changed from half-wise to full-wise in the letter, and his family. Here's one of those copies, and here is another. Now, when we look at the epilogue, what we're allowed to do is to understand the apocalypse from after the event. What we have is Sam sharing with his family that indeed something did happen. There was a violent war. There were questions about evil and good. There was a sacrifice of time and effort and blood, and the ring was destroyed. And what we're allowed to do then is to say, as people who know that conquering has occurred, we are able now to live in a new world, to engender a new community life, and to share with our children what that means. James Berger has written, to see a world as post-apocalyptic is to recognize its formative catastrophes and their symptoms, and to identify the ideological sutures that hide the damages and repetitions. It's also, finally, to recognize and create narratives that work through these symptoms and return to the apocalyptic moments that traumatize and reveal. At that point, new, more healthy, and more truthful histories and futures may be possible. I want to suggest that just as Tolkien intended for the epilogue to allow us to look at Sam's family and to think about, what does it mean to live in a world where the ring has been destroyed? What's our community ethos? What do we teach our children? How do we heal the land? What does it mean to look forward? That if we use that same hermeneutic with the book of Revelation, we might be able to surmount all of the bloody talk that we had from all of those other scholars deriding the book of Revelation. Here's what I mean by that. The book of Revelation, if we read it carefully, tells us about something that's already been accomplished. Yes, there are lots and lots of scenes that seem bloody and violent in the book of Revelation because the vision uses the trope of war to tell a story of a cosmically true, for Christian believers, but already accomplished victory. We read in the letter to the church at Laodicea in Revelation 3:21, to the one who conquers, I will give a place with me on my throne, just as I myself conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. Revelation is not about how someday Jesus is going to conquer by killing in a violent bloodbath all of his enemies. It seems to me, especially if we use the hermeneutic provided by Tolkien's Epilogue, looking back on the story, that Revelation is a story about a cosmic conquering that already happened. Revelation envisions a Jesus who was crucified and who was raised again, thereby having conquered through that sacrifice. We read in Revelation 5:5, the vision of Jesus that John sees in heaven. Then one of the elders said to me, do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals. When John looks, the Lion of the tribe of Judah who has conquered that he sees is a lamb standing as if it's been slaughtered. The conquering has already happened, and the victory occurred through the crucifixion and the resurrection. This is what John's trying to tell us. We don't live in a world where we're waiting a violent bloodbath by a coming conquering Christ, but Revelation tells us we live in a world where the conquering has happened, the city has been established, and we are now to tell the story to our children, reading out of a big book, talking about what it means to heal the world and live in it. By the way, the letter from the king that comes in the epilogue of The Lord of the Rings is a big scroll with seals on it. One wonders how Tolkien was thinking about it all. Then in Revelation 11:15, then the 7th angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. It is a fait accompli. I understand that I'm out of time. I need to just, as a final word, say, if we use the epilogue, and by the way, I want to encourage everyone, when you read The Lord of the Rings next, don't consider yourself finished until you've read the epilogue. Tolkien seems to have intended that way, and it allows us to really place ourselves in the story, looking back on everything that everyone went through and asking ourselves, how will we live in a world now that Sauron has been defeated? How will we live in a world now that we've understood that the power of domination is not the only power in the world? And I want to encourage my Christian siblings, as you think about the book of Revelation, to use the same hermeneutical perspective, to look at it as a story about a conquering that has already happened, a city that is already there welcoming us in, and a program of healing for the world. Because it seems that not only is that what Tolkien intended for the Lord of the Rings, but it seems that that's what John intended as he shares with us that the conquering has occurred, and that we are welcome to participate in the healing. Thank you.
All right, so let's give Jeff a virtual hand for that. Just, I think, a really interesting way of using the Lord of the Rings as hermeneutic, as a theologian and Tolkien scholar who's interested in the question of narrative and narratology and the relationships between religious and ostensibly non-religious texts like the Lord of the Rings. Felt a lot of resonance as with some of the things you were talking about. If you have a question for Jeff, please drop that in the Q&A. It's the best place for us to see it and pass it on. I wanted, as you were speaking, Jeff, there was something that reminded me of the essay Narrative Theory in the Lord of the Rings by Mary Bowman, which was published in 2006. And she has, I think, this really this quote, which she's talking about the elements that you're talking about. And this, I just wanted to share the quote because I think it speaks to something you were describing, which is by reminding readers that we are not inside the tale in the same way that the characters are, Tolkien can, without breaking the spell, communicate with the reader at a level outside the secondary world, inviting us to perceive the frame, to stand in the primary world, watch the sub-creator at work, and notice our own reactions as readers. And I think, first of all, I think that's in relation to some of what you've been talking about. I'm curious if you, that sense of inviting us to perceive the frame, stand in the primary world, and notice our own reactions as readers, if you think that's something which could apply to reading something like the Book of Revelation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm familiar with Bowman's work, and I've got 30 pages. So you can't do that in 20 minutes. But absolutely, I think that if we're self-reflective about how we connect to the story and understand that our place in the primary world is where we do what we do, after all, as Gandalf has said, right, we have to do what we do with the time we are given. And as we look at the secondary world that Revelation presents to us, and the secondary world that Tolkien presents to us, if we're aware that the frame exists, but the wonder of both of those texts is sometimes we forget about the frame, right? So I'm a scholar of Revelation, and when I read it, sometimes I'm sucked into that world. And I'm guessing by virtue of even being at this conference, all of you are like me. Sometimes I'm in Middle Earth for hours at a time, right? It's therapeutic in many ways. And we forget the frame, right? But then we realize that we're on the other side of that frame as well.